Rogo Show. I'm your host, Chase Rogowsky. Today we have a very special episode for you. We'll be interviewing some of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. Thank you. The king of swing himself. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Benny Goodman. Benny, welcome to the show. It's great to see you. You look fantastic.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here. So, Benny, you're one of the most successful jazz musicians of all time, but how did you get your start in music?
Actually, I started playing clarinet when I was about 10 years old. I took lessons at a synagogue near my house in Chicago, and I was trained classically, which is interesting. But then I started playing jazz, and I love jazz. Jazz is the way to go. I started playing with small bands. I played in a dance hall band at the high school near my house, and then I started playing with Ben Pollack, who was a big band leader at the time in Chicago. After that, I moved to New York, and then I played on some recordings there, and then I started my own solo career in about 1931. Just really took off from there, never looked back.
Wow, what a journey. At what point did you start to experience real widespread success?
I would say it was about 1934 probably. We had Fletcher Henderson start writing music for our group, and he gave us a real different sound than anyone else was playing with. And then we got a gig on a radio show called Let's Dance. We were the last band every single night, and people started to listen to us a little bit. But then we went on a tour, and no one was at any of our shows. People didn't seem like they liked us. The critics weren't big fans. But then we played our last show at the Palomar Ballroom in California, and we did so well. Everyone loved it, and we got very famous, and swing really took off from there too. We became one of the biggest bands in the world.
Wow, I listened to that, and that was a fantastic show. By far one of the best I've ever heard. So you mentioned some African-American artists as your biggest influences, and you never seem to shy away from playing with an integrated band. I think at a lot of time when many white musicians did. So what made you decide to do that?
Well, I was initially a little bit nervous about it because I didn't know how our crowds would react. But after I played an integrated show with Eddie Wilson, Lionel Hampton, and everyone loved it. It was just like the quality of the musicians were so high that it just overcame any kind of racial barrier that people would have against it.
I think that's always true. So when you played at Carnegie Hall, you played with these musicians and played the concert of a lifetime. How important do you believe this concert was to your career and to the elevation of swing's popularity as a whole genre?
It was huge because swing before that point was never really viewed as more of an art form. It was more looked down upon a little bit. But then playing at Carnegie Hall, which is such a prestigious establishment, it was just a big accomplishment for the group and for swing as a whole.
So a lot of your sidemen went on to lead successful solo careers. How important were they each to your success and also to your sound?
They were hugely important. Guys like Gene Krupa was our drummer, and he played with a lot of force. No one else played like Gene did, and he really swung our sound really hard. It was awesome. And Charlie Christian was one of the best jazz guitarists of all time. He really was the inventor of electric jazz. Teddy Wilson was a great piano player. All these guys were so good at soloing and improvising. Our shows were so good because they were all so talented.
Yeah, I agree. You have some fantastic shows. So, your big band was one of the most popular groups when swing was at its height. But how did you stay relevant after swing's popularity began to decline?
I wanted to bebop a little bit, but bebop wasn't really for me. I never really got too into it. I just made a few recordings, but then I started playing more classical music. I got trained in classical clarinet again and started playing in a little bit of a different style. And then I started playing swing and back in my old small groups and combos again, and that's mostly what I've been doing since then.
Well, that's our last question for today, but thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Could we get a big round of applause for Benny Goodman?
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Her velvety and girlish tone of voice. A woman whose songs instantly lift you into a good mood. Please welcome the great Miss Ella Fitzgerald. Ella, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Let's get this interview started. So, what was your childhood like?
I believe I have the typical rags to riches story. I was born into poverty in Newport News, Virginia on April 25th, 1917. I moved to Yonkers, New York with my mother when my parents separated, but unfortunately my mother died in an automobile accident when I was 15.
You're known as the First Lady of Song. a very prestigious title. Now tell me, how did you get your start in the music industry?
Well, it's a funny story. I wanted to be a dancer, so I entered in this talent competition at the Apollo Theater in November of 1934. I didn't know what came over me, but that night I panicked and decided to sing instead of dance. Singing in front of that crowd was the moment I knew I wanted to sing professionally, and somehow I miraculously won the competition.
Wow, that is something. Now what happened after you won the competition?
I joined Chick Webb's band as a 16-year-old, and he was my mentor. I recorded my first tune, Lovin' Kisses, in 1935. My first big hit, though, was A Tisket, A Tasket in 1938, which I recorded with Chick.
Well, you know, I love that song, and congrats on selling 1 million copies and being #1 for 17 weeks. Woo! How long did your time with Chick Webb last?
My time with Chick was just a small part of my career, but he had a major impact on me. I made $12.50 a week singing with his band, and I did this for about 4 years. When he died in 1939, I took over leading the band until it broke up in 1942.
That is amazing. Well, you know, not only are you known for your incredible vocal flexibility, but you're also known as scat singing's most well-known practitioner. Tell me more about that.
Well, Louis Armstrong really started it with his tune Heebie Jeebies, but I started to employ scat singing into my own songs as well. When I was performing live in Berlin, I actually forgot the lyrics to the song Mac the Knife, but I just improvised and made the best of it. I threw some scat singing in there and some nonsense words, and I was good to go.
Wow, you improvised that performance? I had no idea. You made everything flow so well.
Thank you. That's the power of good improvisation.
So, you mentioned Louis Armstrong. What's your history with him like?
The public seems to think that Louis and I were romantically involved, but we were just friends as well as a musical duo. We recorded an album entitled Ella and Louis in August 1956. Our voices are two completely different tones, but for some reason the public seems to love us together. We wouldn't have been able to complete the album without the help of Oscar Peterson on piano, Ray Brown on bass, Herb Ellis on guitar, and Buddy Rich on drums. The album was #1 on the jazz charts at the end of the year.
Wow, congratulations. You know, I love that album, and my favorite song off of it is Cheek to Cheek.
Why, thank you. Cheek to Cheek is definitely a crowd favorite.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to seeing you perform soon. Please welcome to the stage world-renowned jazz pianist, composer, and bandleader, Dave Brubeck.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight with the greatest host on TV.
Thank you. I do it for the people. So, Dave, when did you know that you wanted music to be your career?
Well, I actually went to school to become a veterinarian because I was planning on being a cattle farmer like my father. However, after a year I switched to studying music as its allure had become too strong. I graduated, I enlisted in the Army to serve in World War II, and instead of joining the front lines, I mainly helped keep up morale by traveling and playing for the troops. My time in the Army had a big influence on my music, and I saw the horrors of war, and I knew that I wanted to make something beautiful to be my career.
That's really fascinating. Speaking of the Army, isn't that where you first met Paul Desmond? You two formed a wonderful duo. Could you really tell me about that?
Yeah, so Paul and I played together in an octet, and when I formed my quartet in 1951, it seemed natural he would join. He was amazingly talented alto saxophonist, and I think our very different styles complement each other very well. My open, cordial style was perfect foil for his lighter, more economical playing.
So your quartet's music was very different than the bop that was dominant in the jazz scene at the time.
Yeah, like many West Coast musicians at the time, I wanted to veer away from the chaotic sounds of bebop. I wanted the music to resonate with more listeners, and so that was the music that I always strive to create. By merging classical music into what I was playing and spacing the music more, I hope to create a different kind of art than bebop was.
Certainly it worked, as you have had many amazing achievements throughout your career. Could you walk me through some of those?
Yeah, well, in 1954 I became just the second jazz musician to appear on the cover of Time magazine after Louis Armstrong. And of course my record Take 5 was the first jazz record to sell 1 million copies, not that I'm bragging or anything.
And the album it was from, Time Out, was the first jazz album to sell 1 million copies as well. And speaking of Time Out, I've heard that it was inspired by music you heard on your travels. Is that true?
Absolutely, especially in the Middle East when we heard music in unusual meters. Paul Desmond and I thought it would be interesting to incorporate it into jazz. Blue Rondo a la Turk is written in a 9/8 meter and Take 5 is a 5/4 meter. As you can see, both became major hits.
That they certainly did. So our last question, as we're running out of time, You were a civil rights advocate in a time when many weren't. Why was that? What inspired you?
Well, skin colors never really mattered to me. My bassist, Gene Wright, was a black man and one of the best musicians I've ever played with. When colleges told me I couldn't play with an integrated band, I had to fight against them. I also wouldn't tour in South Africa when they gave me the same reasoning. To me, the quality of music is infinitely more important than the skin tone of the musician. I can only do so much, but I try to do as much as I can as a musician.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dave. Today, we have the amazing and talented Miss Billie Holliday. Miss Holliday, how are you today?
Very well, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing superb. Would you mind telling the audience what your full name is?
Well, I go by the name Billie Holliday. I was born with the name Eleanor Fagan on April 7th, 1915. My mother, Sadie Fagan, had me when she was a teen and wed my father 3 years later. His name was Clarence Holliday. He was a jazz artist as well, but I never lived with him or got to really know him. I go by Billie though because one of my favorite actresses is named Billie Dove.
So, Miss Holliday, one may say you've been very successful in the music field. When did you begin singing?
Well, I began singing around 1929 when I first moved to Harlem.
Did your father have any influence or impact on you at all?
No, not at all. I was not close with him. My mother was a big influence on me in my life. She taught me to do whatever it took to survive. At the age of 11, I dropped out of school and I became a prostitute. I chose to start singing because I needed money and different clubs around Harlem could hire me. So things started changing for me though when I sang, when I first sang with Benny Goodman actually, who I heard is here today.
He is here today.
That's amazing. And then after Benny and I recorded together, I signed a recording contract.
So, did you expect your music to become such a hit? Or did you expect people to love your voice so much?
I didn't at all. When I first started working, it was just to survive. I also didn't expect to be a soloist, which was a shocker. The plan had been to be a side singer when I started recording with Teddy Wilson, but then it became something so much more.
So, Miss Holliday, you are a huge singer, but what would you say is your best or greatest song?
I believe that the song with the most recognition would be Strange Fruit. I don't know if you've heard it.
Yeah.
But I first sang this at Cafe Society in New York. It's a poem about the lynching of African Americans, and it was a difficult song to sing, but I chose to embrace it because I felt like it needed to be heard. Some people loved it, and some people hated it.
Thank you. Now, do you feel like your personal life has ever gotten in the way of your musical career?
Over my lifetime, I've struggled with relationships, but I believe they've helped me grow as a singer. My first relationship, which was short-lived, was with my first husband, Jimmy Monroe. And then later on in life, my second marriage was with Joe Guy. Both ending in divorce, which was definitely painful. But my most recent marriage, just 2 months ago, was with Louis McKay, and honestly right now I couldn't be happier.
Well, I'm really happy for you. Have you ever had to deal with the pressures that many musicians, especially jazz musicians, face with consuming substances?
You know, I've had my fair share of struggling with the pressures of taking substances, but I would prefer not to discuss this matter on TV, but I've been told that my voice has gotten deeper over the years and a little grainy, but I don't think it has anything to do with the decisions that I've made in the past and definitely have not affected my career.
Well, thank you. And can I get a big round of applause for Miss Billie Holliday?